Hi, my name is Dave Gilchrist. I manage Bookmarks Bookshop, and I'm very pleased tonight to introduce this relaunch of the Ghetto Fights, which has been a very important book over the years. This is the third edition, written by Marek Edelman, who was one of the leaders of the ghetto fighters in the Warsaw Ghetto in 1941 to 43. We have three speakers tonight. We've got John Rose, who's written the introduction to the book. We have Lorna Brunstein, who is the daughter of two Holocaust survivors. Her father was born in Warsaw, and her mother, Esther Brunstein, many people probably have heard speak, as she, for many years, she toured up and down Britain telling people about the Holocaust. And we have also tonight Mike Faulkner, who is going to sing us the Ghetto Fighter Song in Yiddish and in English. So it's quite an important event for us tonight, so very pleased people are coming along. You'll have time after the contributions to put your questions and contributions in the chat, both on Facebook and YouTube, and we will get our participants to answer questions as best they can. We might even have time for a second round of questions, but we'll see how it goes. The whole evening should take about 1 hour, and I'm going to go over now to Lorna, who's going to be our first speaker. She'll be followed by John, and then Mike singing the song. So, Lorna, over to you.
Hi, thanks, Dave. Okay, hi everyone. I just want to say I've never done this sort of thing before, and I'm not an authority, and any kind of public speaking is absolutely way out of my comfort zone. So bear with me, I will do my best. I've been asked to contribute to this really important event of the relaunch of the Ghetto Fights because of my connection to the Holocaust via my parents, Esther and Stan Brunstein. They met in London in 1947 as Polish Jewish refugees. Both had lost their entire families, excepting one brother on my mother's side. Both were hugely traumatized and damaged by their experiences and losses. When they met, my mother was 19 and my father was 33. They met in the Yiddish theatre of the East End. My father was the scenic designer and my mother an actress. They married in 1949 and I was born in 1950 and my sister Denise in 1954. They were very poor, life was tough, but we somehow got by. I'll backtrack a bit and give you a brief rundown of their respective stories of survival for some context. My father, as Dave said, was from Warsaw, an only child of elderly parents. At the outbreak of the war, he fled east to Russian-occupied Poland, to Bialystok, where he found work as a scenic designer. But in 1940, he was imprisoned without trial as a bourgeois counter-revolutionary, spending 14 months solitary confinement in a 7-foot square cell. He was sentenced to 8 years exile and hard labour in the Vorkuta slave labour camp in the Arctic Circle. He was released after 3 months when Russia joined the war, and he subsequently joined the Polish army under General Anders and was liberated after the Battle of Monte Cassino in Italy. He stayed there for a further 2 years studying fine art and scenic design in Rome, and then came to England where he met my mother. He never saw his parents again. He never had any confirmation of what happened to them. They would have almost certainly been imprisoned in the Warsaw Ghetto and murdered in the death camp Treblinka. He died in 1994, just before his 80th birthday. My mother was from Lodz, a city that had a thriving Jewish community, second only in size to Warsaw. She was the youngest of 3 children, having 2 older brothers who she adored. It was a vibrant Yiddish-speaking, politically active household steeped in the ideology of the Bund, the internationalist Polish Jewish Socialist Party, which at its height before the start of the Second World War, commanded the largest segment of the Jewish vote. Both my grandparents were active members in the party, and my mother describes her childhood as idyllic, imbued with the values of the Bund, those of equality, freedom, and justice. These values stayed with her all her life and saw her through her darkest days. At the outbreak of war, her eldest brother David and her father joined the partisans in Russian-occupied Poland. They died fighting with the resistance. My grandmother and my mother and her older brother Peretz were imprisoned in the Lodz ghetto until early 1944, when Peretz was taken from them and imprisoned by the ghetto police. He was transported to a slave labour camp in Poland and then on to Buchenwald in Germany. He was liberated at the end of the war in Theresienstadt and then flown to the UK as one of the Windermere children. My mother and grandmother were deported to Auschwitz when the ghetto was liquidated in August 1944. And at the selection point, my grandmother was sent to the gas chambers and was murdered. And my mother was selected for work. She was sent to a slave labour camp in Germany, and then towards the end of the war, force marched to Bergen-Belsen, where she was liberated. She was taken by the Red Cross to Sweden, where she recuperated and was reunited with her brother Peretz 2 years later in London. My mum died 3.5 years ago at the age of 88. As second generation, growing up in this household, the Holocaust was always present. It was never off the agenda. And of course, how could it be? So for me, this was the narrative that framed who I was and where I came from. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was a key event, and I remember it being talked about in our household frequently from a very young age, without really knowing what happened, but knowing that it was a very important, significant and serious thing. I remember my parents going to many commemorative meetings, and the anniversary of the uprising was one that was ingrained in my memory as so important it absolutely could not be missed. They always referred to it with a great sense of pride. And I have an image in my memory of the first edition of the book on my mother's bookshelf, which was reserved for very important treasured books. Of course, when I was older, I understood the significance and I read the book myself, which I found to be extraordinary and of huge importance as a first-hand account of what happened. The standard narrative that is so often played is the one, excuse me, of Jews as victims, and one does not often hear so much of the resistance. This book is so important as it counters that narrative. I believe it's essential reading and should be included as a key text and primary source in Holocaust education at every level. When my mother became a public speaker at the time that David Irving was spouting Holocaust denial, she would always stress the importance of remembering that there was resistance, and she addressed many commemorative anniversary meetings herself of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And of course, I need to mention the wonderful partisan song, which came to be associated with the Ghetto Uprising, which was sung and continues to be sung at all important Jewish gatherings. It was my mum's anthem. The first line of the song, "Never say this is the final road for you," is inscribed on her gravestone. She was a proud Bundist and would be so pleased to know that a third edition of this book is being launched. If she was still with us, she would be speaking now instead of me, and much better. So I am going to finish with a few extracts from a speech she made on the 51st anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in Montreal in 1994. So these are her words now. The 19th of April has become the symbolic date when we pay homage to the memory of our heroes and fighters in all the uprisings wherever they took place, in the ghettos, in the concentration camps and partisan groupings. On that day, we also bow our heads low in deep sorrow, but with great pride, in memory of our 6 million martyrs, men, women and children, who did not go like sheep to the slaughter, but silently resisted the brutality of our oppressors against total demoralization. The fighters in the Warsaw Ghetto were the first and almost the only ones from all the enslaved nations in Europe by the Nazis who challenged in open face-to-face combat the German army, which in those days was the most powerful, modern and victorious army in the world. When the German army entered the ghetto in the night of the first Seder meal at Passover, with their fiendish plan to deport all Jews to Treblinka, they were met with a hail of bullets of the Jewish Fighters Organization. Even we, the survivors, when we read Marek Edelman's description in his book, The Ghetto Fights, became overwhelmed with a sense of awe. The heroic deeds of children, women, and men, young and old, who possessed the courage and physical endurance to defend our national pride and human dignity in this unequal fight in which they were doomed from the start, will remain forever a monumental, glorious episode in the history of the Jewish people, as well as of all humankind. As a survivor, I have a moral obligation and a duty to bear witness to the historical truth, especially now when attempts to deny the Holocaust by so-called revisionist historians are rife. A few years ago, the Nobel Prize winner Elie Wiesel said that before Auschwitz, no one could imagine Auschwitz, and after Auschwitz, no one can retell Auschwitz. Of course, it's true, yet it is incumbent upon each one of us who miraculously survived to talk about it and tell the world in simple words what we lived through, what we have seen, and all that we remember, and with the power of words to fight the shameless, vile attempts to destroy the truth. Without the memories of the past, our present existence would be meaningless. Memories are the thread which holds together the past and present and creates a basis for a better, meaningful future. The best way to pay homage to our 6 million martyrs is to tell the world about their extinguished lives, because we are here, wir sennen door, as the inmates of the ghettos and concentration camps used to sing. My aim is to convey in simple words my personal experiences of those dark days and memories of a meaningful life which existed before the onslaught. The older I get, the more vividly I recall fragments of my childhood in pre-war Poland. I treasure those memories which nurtured and strengthened my determination to survive. We all carry the responsibility to tell and retell the tale of our destruction, and to what degree of barbarity and inhumanity creatures in human form can sink to. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Lorna. Incredibly moving and important testimony there. I was very privileged to meet Lorna when we went on a Unite Against Fascism trip to Auschwitz, and how moving it was, to stand there where her mother stood. Now we're going to go over to John Rose, who's going to tell us a bit more about the book and a bit more about the background to the whole ghetto rising. So over to you, John.
All right, thanks very much. And like you, Dave, the chair, I feel quite humbled following Lorna, and indeed, in a sense, following Esther. Lorna has just read from Esther. I knew Esther very well and often spoke with her about the politics we're about to focus on right now. Now, you don't really want to hear my voice. You want to hear the voice of Marek Edelman. And the way I plan to use these few moments is to read three passages that I've selected, which I regard as particularly important. 2 passages to begin with, and then make a comment of my own, and then if we have time to mention the third passage. The first passage is Marek Edelman in the Ghetto Fights describing fear. This is what he says: to overcome our terrifying apathy, to fight against our own acceptance of the generally prevailing feeling of panic, even the small tasks required truly gigantic efforts on our part. It was the children who acted first. Children begged everywhere in the ghetto as well as on the non-Jewish side. 6-year-old boys crawled through the barbed wire under the very eyes of the gendarme in order to obtain food. Often a lone shot in the vicinity told the casual passerby that another young smuggler had died in his fight against omnipotent hunger. Before I go to the second passage, which is about one of the fights itself, I just want to briefly comment on that passage. Fear. We're all locked down at the moment. But it's a voluntary lockdown, and it's almost a luxury compared to the lockdown the people in the ghetto faced. That was a lockdown compulsory, surrounded by Nazi guards. And you knew something horrific was happening because your numbers were depleting as more and more people in the ghetto were taken to the death camps. Between 250 and 300,000 Jews were herded into the ghetto immediately following the Nazi occupation of Poland. And over the first period, the ghetto began to empty in the way I've just described. And I always think that it's important to stress how difficult it is for us to enter that memory world and understand the fear that they must have felt, and to overcome it. What a Herculean task to have overcome it, but that's what certainly everybody tried to do, and in the end the Ghetto Fighters did in a most magnificent way. Let me move to the second passage, which is one of the fights. Notice that Marek Edelman talks about the Ghetto Fights rather than uprising. He was always, I had the great privilege, incidentally, to meet him in 1989 when I got his permission for the book to be published for the first time in Britain. And he was anxious then and remained anxious throughout his life to play down the over-romanticization of what happened in the ghetto resistance. He wanted to be quite cautious, but on the other hand, when you read about what happened, it's difficult to share that caution. Let me perhaps explain why by reading this passage. This is one of the key moments in the fight. Now the Nazis, the SS men, were ready to attack. In closed formations, stepping haughtily and loudly, they marched into the seemingly dead streets of the central ghetto. Their triumph appeared to be complete. It looked as if this superbly equipped modern army had scared off the handful of bravado drunk men, as if those few immature boys had at last realized that there was no point in accepting the unfeasible. But no, they didn't scare us. We were not taken by surprise. We were only waiting for the opportune moment. Battle groups barricaded at the four corners of the street opened concentric fire on them. Strange projectiles began exploding everywhere. The hand grenades of our own make. The lone machine pistol sent shots through the air now and then. Our ammunition had to be conserved carefully. But they attempted to retreat, but we cut their path. Their dead soon littered the streets. And the end only came when the Nazis were forced to set the ghetto on fire. So in a sense, although it was a momentary victory, it was a tremendously important victory, both symbolically and in terms of those trains to the death camp stopped running. They had to destroy the ghetto. They could no longer try to control it. Now, before I move to the third passage, I want just to make 3 points about how we explain the ghetto resistance, how we explain the wider political, the wider politics. I try to address some of these introductions, but given the shortage of time, I simply want to pose the questions that I think need to be answered. The first one is, I said earlier, between 200 and 300,000 Jews were herded into the ghetto, but when the ghetto fights actually began, only 60,000 Jews were left. So what happened in that period, in that first period of, I think, almost 2 years? Why was what appears to be so much passivity? I pose it as a question. I try and answer it. It's very difficult to answer it from the outside with the benefit of hindsight and from the comfort of our own relatively prosperous homes. But I think the question can be answered, and it's worth attempting to do so. The second point I want to discuss very briefly is the role of the Warsaw Jewish Council, which the Nazis relied upon to attempt to control the population. They come in for ferocious criticism, and most of it's quite justified. But they were represented by a man called Adam Chernikov, who, when he realized what was happening, that people were being sent to the death camps, he committed suicide. The Ghetto Fighters denounced Chernikov for committing suicide. They said that he should have led the resistance. Now, it's very easy. My first reaction was understandably perhaps to identify with the Ghetto Fighters' position. But over the years, I've revised my view about that. I don't think I'm in a position to make any judgment about what Chernikov did. But again, I pose that as a question. I address it in more detail in the introduction to the book, and including the conservative Jewish leadership. And again, I ask the reader to make up his or her judgment for themselves. The third point I want to make, and this brings me to the last part of my contribution, is why it was that the ghetto fighters seemed so badly armed. We just heard Marek Edelman describe the single machine gun pistol that they had. They had hand grenades of their own making. Yet there was a wider Polish underground that a year later would organize its own uprising in Warsaw. It's often believed that one of the reasons why the ghetto fighters were so poorly armed was due to the anti-Semitism of the Polish underground. Now, of course, there was a lot of anti-Semitism in Poland. It would be a fool who denied that. But I think the reasons why the Polish underground were unable to arm the ghetto as effectively as they might have done are more complicated. And again, I do try and answer that question in my introduction. Indeed, it's answered partly by one of Marek Edelman's greatest comrades, Antek Zuckerman, who was the liaison with the Polish underground. And unlike Marek Edelman, who was a member of the anti-Zionist Bund, Zuckerman was a member of the socialist Zionists, and they were great friends. But Zuckerman insisted that you must not blame and dismiss the whole of the Polish population as anti-Semitic. And in fact, he said it was a sin, the word he used, sin, to do so. And indeed, the ghetto fighters themselves, one of their last actions, and I finish on this, was to write the most extraordinary manifesto to the Poles, which in my view is one of the greatest documents of solidarity in the 20th century. And I'm going to read you, and I finish with this, a passage from the manifesto to the Poles, which the ghetto fighters nailed to a wall in the ghetto as it was burning. And it reads as follows. I'm just going to read part of it and then conclude. Poles, citizens, soldiers of freedom, through the din of German cannon, destroying the homes of our mothers, wives and children, through the noise of their machine guns seized by us in the fight against the cowardly German police. And I should have mentioned that, of course, some of their weapons they got were taken directly from the Nazis. Against the German police and the SS men through the smoke of the ghetto that was set on fire and the blood of its mercilessly killed defenders, we, the slaves of the ghetto, convey heartfelt greetings to you. We are well aware that you've been witnessing breathlessly with broken hearts, with tears of compassion, with horror and enthusiasm, the war that we've been waging against the brutal occupier over these past few days. Every doorstep in the ghetto has become a stronghold and shall remain a fortress until the end. All of us will probably perish in the fight, but we shall never surrender. In fact, many of the ghetto fighters didn't perish. They managed to escape, and astonishingly, both Edelman and Zuckerman and many others took part in the wider city rising in 1944. And with those remarks, I close my contribution. Thank you.
Thank you, John, for that very illuminating. We're now going to go over to Mike Faulkner, who's going to make some remarks and is also going to sing the Ghetto Fighter Song. So I'm going to go straight over to you, Mike.
Thanks very much, Dave. I'm not going to add anything very much to what both Lorna and John have said, which has been extremely moving and very informative. But I'd just like to make one comment, and that is that it's very, very difficult, I think, for any of us, even with the greatest effort, to imagine the extent of the terror and the horror that faced the people of the ghetto and those who ultimately, in the face of the doom that they knew they faced, decided that they had to do something about it. I think John's right when he says that we should not and we cannot judge those people that didn't join that fight or didn't feel able to. We're talking here about the youth of the ghetto, young people, and I want to say something before I sing the partisan song, something about one or two people who have certainly had an influence on me and my association with this song, which goes back until the late 1950s. First of all, the person that wrote it, he was in his very early 20s. He was born in 1920, so in 1943, 42, 43, he wasn't even 23 years old. He was from Lithuania. His name was Hirsch Klik. and he had a reputation already as an aspiring and very talented poet. According to all the information that we have, he composed a poem which he called Sag nicht keynmol als du gehst den letzten Weg. Never say that you are on the final road. It was a poem, and as far as we know, it was written at the end of 1942 when he was bunkered down with some other young people who were members of the Polish Jewish resistance movement, the Ghetto Resistance Fighters, in the Vilna Ghetto. Now, sometimes this song is referred to as the song of the Warsaw Ghetto, at other times of the Vilna Ghetto. Both are appropriate. Hirschklick was from Vilna, and ultimately he died probably in very early 1944, after the Vilna Ghetto had been liquidated by the Nazis. And he was one of the many who tried to escape from captivity in a concentration camp, and he and many others were shot by Lithuanian guards in that attempt. So the music for this song, which didn't emerge until after the Warsaw Ghetto fight, was written, and these names have been forgotten, but they need to be remembered, by two Russian Jewish composers called Dmitry and Daniel Pokras. They put a march tune in the style of the Soviet early revolutionary marches to these words. And that soon went viral, as they say these days, amongst the partisan groups that were fighting the Nazis in Western Russia, in Poland, and in the forests of Lithuania and the Baltic states. And it later became widely known in France and then throughout the world, as Lorna has already pointed out. I came across it first through the great African-American singer and activist, Paul Robeson, who recorded it in the late 1940s. And it was with Esther, with Lorna's mother and her father, Stan, that we listened to that on the eve of a memorial conference on the Warsaw Ghetto in 1993. Now I'm going to sing, and then I'm going to finish. I'm going to sing two verses translated into English, and I need to say something briefly about this. The translation's a loose translation because a literate translation can't be fitted to the beat of this song. But essentially this one and these two verses do capture most of the meaning and the very spirit of the song in really a very accurate way. And then I'm going to sing three verses of the song in Yiddish. And it's called Never Say That You Are Treading the Final Road. And that is in Yiddish, Sag nicht keynmol als du gehst den letzten Weg. In English, never say that you have reached the very end, though leaden skies the bitter future may portend. For sure the hour for which we yearn will yet arise, and our marching steps will thunder we survive. For sure the hour for which we yearn will yet arrive, and our marching steps will thunder we survive. But not leaden scribes this bitter song we sing. It's not a caroling of bird upon the wing. It was a people midst the crashing fires of hell that sang this song and fought courageous till it fell. 'Twas a people midst the crashing fires of hell that sang this song and fought courageous till it fell. Sag nicht keynmol als du gehst den letzten Weg, Hat Himmeln bleine verstellen bläue Tag, kommen wird noch unser ausgepinkte Show, es wird Päupt und unser Trott mir seinen do, kommen wird noch unser ausgepinkte Show, es wird Päupt und unser Trott mir seinen do. Von grünen Palmenland bis weiten Land von Schnee, wir kommen an mit unser Pein, mit unser Weh, und wo gefallen ist es Spritz von unser Blut, sprotzen weg durch unser Glore, unser Mut. Und wo gefallen ist es Spritz von unser Blut, sprotzen weg durch unser Glore, unser Mut. Das Lied geschrieben ist mit Blut und nicht mit Blei. Es ist nicht ein Lied von so einem Vogel läuft der frei. Das hat ein Volk zwischen Fallen dicke Wind. Das Lied gesungen mit ner Gannes in der Hand. Das hat ein Volk zwischen Fallen dicke Wind. Das Lied gesungen mit ner Gannes in der Hand. So mit keynmol aus du weißt dem letzten Weg, hat Himmeln bleine verstellen blaue Tag, kommen weg noch unser ausgepinkte Show, es wird Päupt und unser Trott, mir sehnen do, mir sehnen do. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Mike. That was fantastic. Thank you. Very moving as well. I've got a large number of questions now coming up in the chat. So we might have time for 2 rounds if we're lucky. We haven't really decided who's going to answer which questions, but I'll put them out there and then I'll kind of see who wants to answer what. Okay. Let's start here. Alex says that I found reading the Ghetto Fights so inspiring and so important in understanding a Jewish history of resistance. What do speakers think about how we encourage this to be part of mainstream education? That's one question. Second question, what was the international impact of the ghetto resistance? That's a very interesting question. A question that's perhaps for Lorna there, which was, sorry, I had it here, which basically, you know, how you're finding the book on your mother's bookshelf. You know, what does that bring back? What was that like? Kind of a thing. Is that enough questions for now? Do people want to come back on those? And then we can take some more. I don't know, who'd like to go first? Anyone? John? John, you're muted. You'll have to unmute yourself, I think. No, you're good. You're good.
Okay. About the Ghetto Fights entering mainstream education, I certainly, yes, I think it should. I think it should at 2 levels. I think it obviously needs to be integrated into formal education curriculum, both at school, college and university level, where it's appropriate. But I also think there's a wider question buried here in terms of the importance of the Ghetto Fights for today politically, in terms of the resurgence of the far right in a very menacing way right across the world, and the lessons that we can learn from the Ghetto Fights. Certainly, it's an inspiring story just in itself, and the inspiration, as I think one of your questioners made the point, of that in itself has a power. But I think also there are additional specific factors in terms of how the Ghetto Fighting Organization came together. I didn't really have time to go into that, but just briefly, I always like to think of it in with 3 ideas. First of all, once they'd overcome that fear that Marek Edelman had described, it was in the question of organization. But there were several organizations. with a history of bitter feuding before the ghetto was formed, before the Nazis had arrived, a bitter feuding in pre-war Poland. The anti-Zionist Bund, the Socialist Zionists and the Communists. But they were all in the ghetto. They had to learn to work together. They had to learn ultimately to fight together. So that brings us to the second main point, which is unity, organization, unity. And then finally, when I read from the Manifesto to the Poles, the word in my mind, I think I mentioned it, was solidarity. So in terms of both mainstream education, but also lessons for today in a more general political sense, I think organization, unity and solidarity are absolutely keynote ideas, arguments that we carry today forward for us to be able to withstand the pressure of the far right and to be able to overturn the threat that they pose. Just briefly on the second question, the international impact of the ghetto resistance, I'm not an expert on this. My understanding is inevitably it came out in the form of rumor. It clearly didn't come out in the form of a formal kind of media reporting. It came out slowly as rumor, as part truth, and so on. It only really, I think, I'm correct in thinking, after the war, the full story could be told properly. Just a point I should have made at the very beginning. The edition of the Ghetto, all these editions of the Ghetto Fights are based on an edition that was brought out by the New York Bund in 1945. In other words, we didn't do the translation. The first translation from Polish and Yiddish into English was in America, and it's the American edition from New York that we're using. So certainly by then, it was very widespread. The news had certainly become very well known internationally by the end of the war. The extent to which it was known in 1943-44 itself, I'm not entirely clear about. Perhaps Lorna or Mike would like to follow on that.
Yeah, yeah, I'll say something about that. I just made a few notes, but it was just thinking about Mum really, and what she said and how she felt, and she always talked about education as the key. It's and our only hope. That's why when she became a public speaker and spoke, on anti-Nazi League platforms up and down the country, she also went to schools, and she went to so many schools speaking to children and students about the importance of remembering and why it's so important. Some of her quotes, I was just remembering, she always said, any act of bullying, name calling, no matter how small, ultimately can lead you to the gates of Auschwitz. So she always made her experiences when she spoke, it was never just talking about what happened to her. It was, why is it important that you know what happened to her? It's not because she wanted to tell her, talk all about herself. It was because of the relevance with now, and with the rise of the extreme right now, it's more important than ever. So, and stay vigilant is what she always said. So yeah, that's my thoughts on that. And about the book, I was young. I was quite young. I can't remember. I have to confess, I can't remember exactly the moment when I saw that book. But when I was preparing for this this event, I remembered the book on a bookshelf, and that bookshelf was full of loads of books, and big, weighty, heavy books, and the Ghetto Fights book. She used to say, to me and my sister, you must read these. And when I was young, as I said, growing up in that household, it was, the Holocaust was there all the time, and there were times when I guess it was too much, and I didn't want to know. I didn't want to know. It was only when I got a bit older that I did. So yeah, I just remember seeing it there on the bookshelf, and she did say it's a very important book. You must read it sometime, and I did. So that's that.
Mike, would you like to join in? You have to unmute yourself.
The first time I heard this song sung, apart from listening to it on a recording, on a vinyl recording, was when in 1960 I was part of an international work brigade in Cuba, the first one that ever went there immediately after the Cuban Revolution. And there were about 250 people from different countries. And amongst those 250 people, I don't know how many, but there were a group of American radicals, socialist communists, some from Argentina, from France, and elsewhere. And they decided, suddenly a group of them emerged, about maybe 6 or 7 or 8 or 10 people, and they sang Zog mit keynmol in Yiddish. And it turned out that the only way that some of the people on the work camp could communicate with each other in a lingua franca was through Yiddish, because people spoke Yiddish in those days to a greater extent than they do now. And the friend of mine who led the singing of that song in Cuba in 1960 called me 2 nights ago to tell me that he was going to be listening into this program and he was going to correct my pronunciation later if he had to. So that's my contribution. But it was known, it was an international radical song, which was part of the whole radical tradition. And it's stayed so ever since.
Perhaps we can get you to sing it again at the end, Mike, if you feel you're up for
Sorry?
that. Perhaps we can get you to sing it again at the end.
Well, I'll sing one verse, or a couple of verses.
Okay.
But we're not at the end yet, are we?
No. I've got more questions first. Yes. I've got a question here from Dave Rosenberg, who says, he's got a comment first and then a question. He says, what is most remarkable from Edelman's book is when you read that the hundreds of fighters were aged from 13 to 40, so very young.
Yeah.
And what also comes through is that the United Fighting Organization of Bundists, Communists and Left Zionists were all of the left. So his question is, to what extent did the role of the Bund in fighting anti-Semitism and fascism in 1930 prepare it to play a key role later in the ghetto uprising? And also, how important do you think that non-combat work was? Things like underground resistance newspapers and so on. There's a question that might be addressed more directly to John, which is maybe he could say a little more about how he discovered the book and what it was like meeting Marek Edelman. Let me see, do I have another question? There's a comment here from Paul who says that was very powerful. Thank you, Mike. He says that the Black Lives Matter movement shows that the potential for many to unite against fascism, both here and internationally. In his question, is the book known much in Poland, and can it be reprinted there?
Can I just say a word about that?
Yeah, go on, Mike.
I spent many years, like John, I know, teaching in further education colleges. And the first copy of the book that I read in English actually was before the one that John's took, before the one we've got here. And it was brought back by a student of Polish origin who was in one of my history classes. And there was an English edition, English language edition published in Poland. And she brought that back in 1992. So they certainly were publishing it then.
Right. So the other questions, anyone want to come in on them? Go on then, John. Are you putting your hand up?
I think Dave Rosenberg was one of the questioners. I think you said it was from David Rosenberg. David Rosenberg is a good friend of mine, and his partner Julia Bard. They're members of the Jewish Socialist Group, which regards themselves as in the tradition of the Bund. And I've known them for many years. And as a matter of fact, when I first came across, and I'll come on to this in a moment, Marek Edelman's book, and got the opportunity to meet Marek Edelman, I went to see David and Julia and spent a lot of time talking to them about the Bund. Dave asked the question about the Bund fighting anti-Semitism in Poland in the 1930s. He asked me the question. Frankly, I learned a great deal about that from Dave and Julia. So I can't really tell them any more about it that they already know. Perhaps to the wider audience, of course, the Bund played a tremendously heroic role. It was the leading organization resisting anti-Semitism in 1930s Poland. And I was very fascinated when I first learned about the Polish Bund, not least because, and it's already become clear from what Lorna has said, this involved thousands of Jewish working class families, men, women and children. As Poland became increasingly shifted to the right before the war, unfortunately with an increasingly menacing fascist movement of its own, anti-Semitic movement of its own. And so resistance to the homegrown Polish anti-Semites was incredibly important. Lorna's mother, Esther, wrote movingly about that period as well, and about how the Bundist families and how the Bundist tradition, the culture, the socialist culture of the Bund, helped the Bundist street to hang together, to resist together, gave each of them confidence. I'm sure Lorna would like to comment on that much more effective than I'm able to do so. But the short answer is the Bund was absolutely indispensable in terms of the resistance to anti-Semitism before the Nazis arrived, in terms of Poland's own homegrown anti-Semitism. In terms of discovering the book, as a matter of fact, the book was discovered by a great friend of mine called Mike Simons. I hope he's watching. He and I both worked on the newspaper The Socialist Worker in the 1970s, and Mike Simons discovered an old copy of the Ghetto Fights in his granny's attic, in his grandmother's attic, and he told me about it. We were both absolutely astonished when we read it. And we came to the conclusion, we heard that Marek Edelman was still alive, not simply still alive, but the sole survivor of the 5-person command team that led the resistance, that led the ghetto rising. What would be the opportunity, the possibility of getting his agreement for us to publish the book, because it hadn't been published in Britain, which does raise, and I just touched on this very briefly, it quite rightly hasn't been a dominant theme this evening, but people may well know of the understandable bitter enmity between the Bund and the Zionists. And I have to say that the Jewish community leadership in Britain has not regarded the Bund and Edelman's book with great favoritism over the years. And it's one of the reasons why it took such a long time for it to be published. When it was published, there was quite an argument in the Jewish community. And I report on that argument through a series of letters that were exchanged between me and various other people in the Jewish Chronicle. And those letters are reprinted in the book for people to have a look at if they would like to do so. But anyway, I met Marek Edelman at his home in Łódź, and inevitably in awe of this man who, by the way, another point, in a sense a small point, but not such a small point, he insisted after the war in staying in Poland. Most of his comrades who survived either went to America or Israel, but he insisted he was Polish and wanted to stay in Poland, and indeed became a surgeon. And he put it very simply. He said, I started the business of saving lives in the ghetto and completed the business of saving lives in post-war Poland as a surgeon. I think that's absolutely brilliant. And incidentally, when I met him in 1989, he was part of the Solidarity Round Table, negotiating with the Communist Party government as it disintegrated and made way for what was to become the first Solidarity government in the early 1990s. Edelman played his part in that. When he appeared at a Solidarity conference, the entire audience, all the conference delegates rose to their feet and cheered to the rafters for this great hero. So he was a hero, not just in our eyes. People are watching this presentation this evening. He was also a hero to all the survivors of the Polish underground, and indeed to the new resistance movement in solidarity in the 1980s. Marek Edelman was a hero. And I'll leave that there.
I'd like. Hello. Yeah, I'd like to say something too, just to mention about the Bund. That my mum said, you know, she said it wasn't just a party that you belonged to. It was a whole way of life. It was your family. It permeated everything. She belonged to a youth group. There was a younger youth group and an older youth group. I think David Rosenberg, if he's out there, will correct me on this if I get it wrong. But I think one was called Skiff and one was called Zukunft. I think Zukunft was for the older children, and it meant the future. And they were going to change the world. That was the mission. They were going to change the world and make it a better place. And that's what drove her. That's what, you know, that mattered, and saw her through in the ghetto. So yeah, it did sound amazing. And she always talked about it in, you know, as the most important key foundations of her life, that she always hung on to those values. Yeah, I think that's all.
Don't know, Mike, do you want to add anything?
I don't think I can add anything of any value after what other people have said.
Okay. Just I think maybe time for maybe one more question, which I've of course lost now. Oh yes, it was from Miriam Schaaf, who says pride in this Jewish resistance should mean that Marek Edelman would be a hero around the world, and in Israel too. He definitely is for international-minded Jews, but he never went, or rather, he stayed in Poland and didn't go to Israel. Did he have explicitly anti-Zionist a position, or was it for other reasons? I think, John, do you want to come back on that?
Bund was explicitly an anti-Zionist organization, and it's very important perhaps to stress that fact now, especially after all the appalling attacks on Jeremy Corbyn during his period as leader of the Labour Party, as though the Zionist view of Jewish history is the only view of Jewish history that counts. And it's one of the great tragedies about the Bund is this alternative Jewish tradition from the late 19th and 20th centuries was destroyed in the Holocaust. So many of the Bundist activists were destroyed. It was very difficult, if not impossible, to keep that particular tradition alive. But Edelman personified that tradition. And he did go, I think he did go to Israel to see friends. I said, already mentioned, he had a great friend who was a Zionist called Antek Zuckerman. I'm pretty sure he visited Antek. But one very important political factor that grows out of this is that Marek Edelman, because of his position, supported the Palestinians. And he supported the Palestinians, but he was critical of suicide bombing. And he wrote to the Palestinian leadership just before he died. And it's a wonderful letter, actually. It's almost worth, and perhaps the next time we do a copy of the book, we should include this letter to the Palestinians, appeal to the Palestinians. He's saying you're making a mistake about suicide bombing, but we speak as comrades. I speak as your comrade and regard you as, and I hope you regard me as a comrade. That your resistance in its own way is as important as our resistance. In other words, Marek Edelman saw the ghetto resistance to the Nazis, and in a similar way, I don't want to equate the two, but in a similar way, that the Palestinians are resisting the Zionist occupation. He saw that the ghetto fighters were the oppressed, fighting the oppressor. So there's absolutely no ambiguity in his position, either about Israel or the Palestinians, and it's an important additional consideration. And I'm very glad that Miriam has introduced this into the discussion.
Okay, so that is sort of bringing us towards the end of the evening. I don't want to push Mike to sing again if he doesn't want to, but do you?
What I'll do, I'll sing two verses. Okay, is that okay? If people want me to. Okay. Sag nicht keynmol is de geesten letzten Weg. Sog nicht keynmol, als du gehst im letzten Weg, hat Schimmeln bleine verstellen bläue Tag. Kommen wird noch unser ausgebänkte Show, so svete Poit und unser Trott, mir seinen do. Kommen wird noch unser ausgebänkte Show, so svete Poit und unser Trott, mir seinen do. Das Lied geschrieben ist mit Blut und nicht mit Blei. Es ist kein Lied von Vogel läuft er frei. Das hat der Volk zwischen Fallen dicker Wind. Das Lied gesungen mit ner Gannes in der Hand. Das hat der Volk zwischen Fallen dicker Wind. Das Lied gesungen mit ner Gannes in der Hand. Okay.
Thank you again, Mike. I believe Lorna's got a few concluding remarks. Yes.
Oh, hang on. Yeah, all I wanted to say was going back to I think what John said about Poland and anti-Semitism, and it just reminded me of. So my mum said yes, the anti-Semitism when she was growing up. She was 11 when the war broke out, so she had very strong memories of vicious anti-Semitism. She remembered having stones thrown at her over Easter, saying, and she was young, she was 5 or 6, saying, "You killed our Lord Jesus," and lots of other incidents of anti-Semitism. But what she also said was that it's really important to remember acts of kindness, and there were acts of kindness that she remembered, and she said that's keeping hold of your humanity, to remember those acts of kindness. And she also said when she was liberated at Bergen-Belsen, and she had typhus and she was unconscious on the day of liberation, but came round I think the day after. She was ready to die. She thought she was going to die. She came round the day after and saw two rolls of bread at the foot of her bed and white sheets, with 2 corpses on either side, because there were 3 of them who had been put into this room, not expected to live. She did, and she saw out of the door of this room the bodies, those piles of corpses that I'm sure those of you who've seen that sort of Belsen footage will know. And she said some of the prisoners, sort of within the inmates within the camp, were trying with whatever strength they had to attack their officers, the guards who were still there, and they were throwing stones at them, doing whatever they could, and wanted to kill them. And she said, her quote was, "There was murder in all of them, and there was murder in me too." But what she also said was, when she realized she had those thoughts, she said, "No, I can't go down that road," and said, because I've written it down, I remembered it, "Do not be consumed by hatred." She didn't want to be consumed by hatred all her life, because then you are no better than them. And I just think that's a good one to kind of keep hold. And Mum always said that. So I just wanted to mention that.
Thank you again, Lorna. As I mentioned before, Lorna and I met on the Unite Against Fascism trip to Auschwitz. It was very moving to stand where her mother had stood. I don't think that the trip will be happening this year because of coronavirus, but if it is, or certainly next year, if it's possible, if anyone wants to go along, I'm sure we will have leaflets in the bookshop eventually, and you can get in contact that way, or contact through Unite Against Fascism. The book is in the shop, is available from our online sales. We are kind of hoping to open the shop on the 29th of June, at first by appointment only, and for pickups and that kind of thing. So we have, we've managed quite well, I think, over the period with the online service, but we are hoping to get back into business, because if we could do nothing else, if we can get books like this out into people's hands, then we'll have done a service. So I'm going to thank all our participants tonight, which was a very important and very moving meeting. Next week, we have a book called Resist, which has various stories in it. One of which, and since we know he's watching tonight, is from David Rosenberg. I think about a Cable Street, so there's some continuity there. But it's just a book about different resistances to oppression and exploitation around the country. So hope you will join us again. And in the meantime, buy the book, and when we're open, come and see us at Bookmarks, because we're always very happy to see people. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.